Welcome, friends, to this episode of the Sync Your Life podcast. I am so grateful today to be joined by Jenni Lord. She is the CEO of Chosen. We're going to hear all about Chosen. We're going to hear about her mission with Chosen today on the podcast. This month, we're doing a feature on adoption. It's National Adoption Month. And I just want to make sure that people are aware of everything having to do with adoption. I want to lessen the fear for potential adoptive parents, but I also want those adoptive parents to come into the process prepared and understanding really what's involved, both the good and the bad, and the ugly and the stressful. So we're going to talk a lot today about trauma. We're going to talk about the role of trauma in an adoption process and in a family. And Jenni and I had the chance to touch base a few weeks ago, and I honestly we could have talked for probably 2 hours. And I just said, you know what, let's hold this content for the actual podcast, because I think you guys are going to learn a lot from Jenni today. So let's just go ahead and get started. I'll have you just sort of introduce yourself, share where you're from, tell us a little bit about Chosen, and we'll get started.
All right. Good morning, Jenni. Great to see you. And thanks for having me on. I am Jenni Lord, CEO of Chosen, as Jenni said, and I have been with the organization since the very beginning. I had the idea for Chosen in 2008 and worked all of 2009 to get it off the ground, and was really birthed out of a passion for adoption. And I didn't know I was starting a nonprofit, didn't have nonprofit experience, just kind of backed into this world, but really had a heart to see children in loving families. And I have a personal connection to adoption. I have a brother who was adopted out of foster care, and we are actually 17 years apart. So he was coming into our family as a toddler while I was starting my freshman year of college. And that journey marked me tremendously. And I didn't have a career path in child advocacy, but because of what I saw in child welfare, really had a burning passion for what I would call systemic transformation that is desperately needed, and saw an opportunity to start something that could help families who wanted to adopt. And just used another passion of mine to start that journey with running, which was kind of crazy, but I had an idea to start a half and full marathon that would benefit adopted families. And at that time, there weren't a lot of cause-related runs, and there wasn't a half and full marathon in the city that I live in. I'm from Texas. I have 4 biological children and have been married for almost 18 years. And I was a passionate runner and thought that I could use that to draw in families who wanted to adopt and support them. So worked all of 2009 and got that off the ground in 2010. And it has been a crazy journey since. I like to say that you never know what's on the other side of your yes to God. So that was how it started.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, and I know that it's evolved since then. I know that things have shifted, and we're going to touch on that today. But I want to come back a little bit to what you mentioned about just your, you being a teenager and this foster brother coming into your life. I'd love for you to share what impact did that have on you specifically? Like what, share as much as you're willing to share, but what about that really impacted you into perhaps pursuing this in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's a big answer, so I'll try to be brief. But he was 19 months old, and my mom was a very young mom, and she just really she thought she had more love to give and wanted to keep her heart and home open to more kids. And he was the first child that came into our home. And we, at that time, this was 1995, and we just didn't know about trauma and the impact. And he was so precious, but he had a lot of really big behaviors that were challenging and very challenging. And the first 6 weeks, we weren't sure that we were going to be able to make it as a family in keeping him, because it was so hard. And so that was eye-opening, and we loved him and wanted to take care of him. His biological mom was not safe to go back to, and the state was working to get them reunified. And at that time, the laws in Texas allowed for foster journeys to continue on and on and on. There wasn't a time limit. And so his journey with our family took about 4.5 years to complete to adoption. So he was adopted at 6 when I was graduating from college. And seeing the inside of child welfare for 4.5 years, my goodness, my eyes were just really open. Like, how can a system that's designed to protect children, how can they actually fall through the cracks and be harmed? And I just saw that really up close and personal, and it really marked me. I thought that I wanted to go to law school because I felt like there needed to be change, and where could you make the biggest impact for that change? And obviously legal transformation is part of it. But I ultimately decided I didn't want to pursue law school because I wanted to have a family and not work 100 hours a week. But I was really burdened by what I saw and knew, and I think God just really fanned a flame. I have the heart of an advocate, and I will defend the weak and the vulnerable, and that was lit up inside of me based on our early experience with my brother.
For sure. Yeah. And I could even just tell from your personality, right? Like if you're attracted to law, that means you're willing to argue, you're willing to advocate, you're willing to, speak up. I always say I missed my calling as a lawyer because I am the best arguer on the planet. So totally understand where you're coming from. So this idea of, children sort of falling through the cracks, I'd love for you to elaborate on that as well. I mean, my personal story for my podcast listeners, obviously up until this point, I've talked a lot about hormone health. But adoption is a big part of my story as well. I was adopted at birth, and then both of my daughters are adopted as well. And both, all three of those situations were adoptions at birth, as opposed to fostering first. And so foster care is not something that I've personally experienced, but I have had family members and loved ones go through that experience. So I'd love for you to sort of shed some light for the person who maybe isn't super familiar. What does that mean to fall through the cracks?
It's different now, having been in this field for almost 15 years. I have a different perspective even than I did then. It was very personal to me then of how somebody making life altering decisions for this child who hasn't even talked to us as a family, who hasn't talked about what happens to him after birth visits, and what are we seeing that he was exposed to before, in his first 18 months of life. So that was then. Now what I would say is that our system it's a system of last resorts, and what that means is that the government is going to protect a child in their physical safety. So they're making decisions for a child based on physical safety. I've been a foster parent, and when we got licensed, the caseworkers coming to make sure that the meds are locked up, and that the guns are locked up, and where's the ammunition stored, and are the outlets all plugged. It's all about physical safety. And what I know now is that is woefully insufficient. The mental health and well-being of a child that's not even considered in the decisions that are made is really tragic. And so when I say kids who fall through the cracks now, what I see is, people who are making the best decisions they think based on the child's physical safety aren't considering the other factors of what makes up a child. And when they have really big behaviors because of the trauma that they've experienced, and somebody says, I can't be a foster parent anymore, this child has to go back, then decisions are made again about that child based on physical safety, and you're not even considering the whole child and the impact that's underneath those big behaviors, which is really, it's tied to loss and grief. And I'll get into that trauma piece later, but it is more than just, oh, people always say kids are resilient, and that's a fallacy. The life altering decisions that are made around children in foster care is going to have a lifelong impact on them. And I think sometimes we're making decisions for kids and not even considering that.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. It makes total sense. I mean, even I shared with you previously, even in our, adoption at birth processes with our daughters, the system, so to speak, right? The social worker that we worked with for our home study and sort of the system side of the whole thing was so interesting, right? Like it's again very focused on physical safety, and we had to get our fingerprints done and drug tested, and our house had to be examined to make sure outlets were covered and all these things. And then you're thinking to yourself, like, but what if an adoptive set of parents are like emotionally unstable, or what if they're not prepared for what can manifest when the child, especially as the child gets older. Like, what about the sort of emotional preparedness of this process? And to me, even on this side of it, not on foster care, but on this side of adoption too, we felt very underprepared, even having been an adopted child myself. And so I think it's across the board, right? I think this is something that's hopefully your organization and others are starting to shed light on. Yeah, but I wanted to make sure we covered, sort of your definition of that. And I think that's a powerful start. So I want to hear a little bit about like how your mission has changed, right? Like, so how Chosen came into being, but then also how has it morphed from there?
Sure. So in the beginning, I would say it was really at the height of what I would call an awakening. In the early 2000s, the church had woken up to, wow, we're responsible for caring for orphans, and then we have an orphan care crisis around the world. And oh, we've got a foster crisis in our own backyard. There's 500,000 kids in foster care. And so our, people my age were in 30s in early 2000s were really saying, I might adopt if I knew where to start, or I might adopt if we had the finances, or I would consider foster care. Like, I have more love to give. So it's a big conversation in our community. And I had a friend that adopted internationally in 2006. And so I saw that process up close and personal. And when I had the idea, it was really around funding adoptions. And so we did that for about 5 years. We funded probably around $1 million in adoptions from people all over the country. The race was extremely successful because it built community around these adoptive families in their journey. And it was, euphoric actually, when these families are so excited about welcoming a child in their home, and you're getting all the support around you and building a team that can run with you in your journey. And so we were doing that. And in about 2014, my eyes were really opened to something I didn't know was happening, which was adoption disillusion. What that means is literally rehoming of a child. So child is adopted, and then things aren't going well. And so a family chooses to rehome the child. And I will say, caveat here, that has to be one of the most difficult decisions that any parent could ever face. And we've walked so closely now with so many adoptive families. I can understand how they get to that point of desperation and hopelessness. But then in 2014, all I could think about was a child experiencing that sense of abandonment again. And my brother's journey has been extremely difficult. He has unfortunately fallen prey to almost every statistic of what could go wrong, but we never considered rehoming him. And so really it was a stewardship question of, okay, we're funding adoptions, and that's almost transactional in a way, right? You're writing a check, and then, okay, good luck with the rest of your life. Like, I went to who is now our chief program officer. She was a volunteer at the time. And I said, I feel like we have a stewardship obligation to these families that I'm going to be held accountable for. If their adoption falls apart in a few years, like, what is our responsibility? And we can't do everything, but can we do better? Can we help prepare families for what they're saying yes to? Because people go into adoption with the best of intentions. They want to do good, help a child in need, open their heart and home, but oftentimes they don't know what is on the other side of that yes. And so could we help prepare families better, but also could we walk with them long term in the journey? Because the marathon parallels in the adoption journey are strong. And I think that you could probably say, yeah, you feel like you've run a marathon just getting to the point of closing the adoption, and then the work really begins. So instead of, okay, good luck with the rest of your life with this check, can we journey alongside a family? So that's how we made a shift from funding adoptions into what we're doing now.
Yeah. So you literally just, you said, not only do we want to create families, but we want to make sure those families can sustain, right? And we want to make sure that these children are cared for long term. So I know that when we had talked previously, the most impactful thing that you said, which it was not the first time I'd heard it, but it was like the first time I heard it in the way I needed to hear it, was you said adoption comes from loss. And until we acknowledge that and really dive into sort of the trauma piece surrounding, the child, we can't really fully be prepared as adoptive parents or otherwise. So I'd love to sort of dive into that. I'd love to sort of get into this conversation about trauma and what it looks like to really walk alongside a family in this journey.
Sure. So let me say this. Adoption is beautiful. It is so beautiful, but it is born out of loss. Somebody is losing, and the child is losing their connection to their biological family, which is it's biological. So there's going to be a loss felt at some point. Even in the best of circumstances, when a mom or dad and mom and dad make that decision, the child still has lost a connection to the family. So you were adopted at birth, your children were. There's loss that has to be grieved at some point in the journey. In the space that we work most predominantly in with foster care, kids come into foster care because of abuse, neglect, abandonment, substance abuse, and domestic violence. So there's a number of big things that have made that decision, that go into making that decision to put a child into foster care. But still, underneath even abuse and neglect, there is loss and grief. And that has to be recognized. And unfortunately, the system does not recognize that. So, as beautiful as adoption is, and I think that that's what really happened in that 2000 to 2010, when it was adoptive families were almost seen as heroes. And people even use that language, or that they were rescuing a child. And it's a wrong paradigm, because there is a loss. And so, and it also sets the parents up for failure and shame and isolation, when if you're seen as a hero and that you're rescuing this child, and then once that child comes into your home, if things start going poorly, which we often see when the wheels start coming off, there's even families that they have that feeling of like, did we make a mistake? Did we not hear from God? Am I ruining my biological children? Am I ruining my marriage? And so those are really big things and questions to wrestle with when you were once seen as a hero. And then you don't maybe have a safe place to express those dark thoughts. And so that's the space that we want to make sure that we are walking into adoption eyes wide open. It's beautiful. It's wonderful that a child has a home. Children don't belong in a system. They certainly don't belong in institutions. But we have to understand that it's complex.
Yeah. So I'd love to hear, in what ways, I guess, specifically, do you sort of prepare families or walk with them through this? I mean, again, it's, we always want to think about our own experience when we're hearing something. So I'm thinking about this from my own story personally and with my girls. I remember hearing this from our social worker, and it was kind of just a fleeting statement. It wasn't something that we spent a lot of time on, but it was the same idea that at some point you as the adopted child will grieve this loss, regardless, right, of whether it's from foster care or birth, just because of that biological connection. And it's interesting. We've had friends who've also adopted, and we've heard stories about sort of the trauma manifesting, especially like in our friend who has a 6-year-old daughter who's really struggling with it right now and asking a lot of questions and hitting pictures of her family and saying some things, things like that. And so we're seeing that happen. We also know that Like my oldest daughter is, in kindergarten. And so we've always talked about it, and it's always been part of her story, but we also want to be open to talking about her feelings and be there for her during that. But I'm wondering, especially from the foster care perspective, what types of things have you found to be most successful in helping those families really be prepared to experience that trauma and to help the child through it, and to also remain steadfast themselves?
It's a good question. And Chosen's work now, unfortunately, we really don't work much on the preparation side. And I'll tell you why. And I sat in foster care when we were getting licensed. I sat in those classes and I heard the conversations, and I understand you hear the worst stories, but you don't think it's going to happen to you. Or you think that and you think that you're prepared, and you're like, well, I've read the books, like I'm trauma informed. But then you have a real child with real issues that is maybe an age that you didn't sign up for in your home, and now it's like, okay, how do I employ this different parenting tactic that I've never used before, right? And so people think that they don't need as much help as they do on the front end. And because we're not a licensing agency, we're not licensing foster parents, that's not typically when we see foster adoptive families. They're typically coming to us in crisis, when the wheels are coming off, when those behaviors are manifesting because of the loss and grief that child has experienced. And it can be extremely confusing, frustrating, difficult for the parents, because they're trying to do a good thing, and now the child's behaviors maybe are out of control, or they are punching the pictures, and you're like, we didn't learn how to deal with this. Like, I'm not sure, like, we don't want to dishonor bio mom, but you've got to recognize this child has big feelings that are totally understandable, but you don't know how to navigate that. So we're really helping more on that side of things than on the preparation. Certainly, as an agency, just because of our name and we are a national organization, we have people come to us from all over and ask questions, and we point them to the right types of books and podcasts and things to help prepare them, but that's not our primary role.
Yeah. And I'll say too, I remember thinking this, I mean, we had to go through the home study process twice for our girls, and education's required. I think it's 30 hours in Indiana, for both my husband and myself. And it was interesting because the list of resources that we were given, books and so forth, courses or whatever to take, I think over 90% of the list that we were given was books from like the 70s. There was nothing like up to date, and very little on trauma. I mean, we adopted transracially, so we were sort of, I won't say forced, but highly encouraged to take the route of doing most of our education in transracial adoption. But once again, it still didn't quite get deep enough, in my opinion, to the level that it needed to get to, right? Like, that's something that I've had to take on myself and learn through as we go. So, I mean, I love what you're doing. I love, Chosen's mission, and how you're just constantly sort of what needs served, who needs served, and how can we adjust this accordingly. I'd love, for anyone listening to this who's considered adoption, and maybe you're considering, you don't know which route to go. You have more love to give, and you're thinking about fostering, or you're thinking about adopting at birth regardless. What would your advice be? Like, what do you wish people knew before they headed into that process?
Well, I think we've talked about some of the things that I wish people knew, that it is beautiful, but it is born out of loss. And to do your homework, to know what you're signing up for, and to be prepared, and to be ready to get extra help. We wish people would come to us sooner. And I heard this fantastic analogy, and it really illustrates this. So if you've been white water rafting, you've got a guide, and you're standing on the shore, and he's talking you through, preparing you to go on the rapids. And he's like, okay, first things first, put on your life jacket. And you're like, I'm standing on the shore. Like, why do I need the life jacket? Like, right? And then you hit the rapids, and you're like, oh, thank God I have on this life jacket. I'm about to go overboard. Well, That's a good picture of what we see, where people don't think that they need those resources, or they may not need Chosen because, and we hear this all the time. I've raised 3 kids. I've launched 3 kids successfully, and I know how to parent. My husband's a minister. I've had friends that adopt, and then they sign up and doing a good thing and get into trouble. And so it's just important to know that it's okay to ask for help. We loved, our staff, the majority of our staff has lived experience, and there is nothing that replaces that lived experience, because you've been in the ditch, you've been in the dark places, you've had the thoughts, and you've navigated really big behaviors and the trauma and working with biological families, and all the complexity of this is so helpful. And so it's not, you may need more than just a support group. You may need expertise, and that's okay to get the help, because we want people to have successful adoptions. We don't want people dissolving a placement and a child to be rehomed, and because that's just one more trauma and one more loss that child would experience. So I would just say, being willing to ask for help. And obviously we've talked about a number of things and just getting prepared, but understand that it is a journey, and it's a lifelong commitment. And the reality is, Jenni, sometimes people, in our case, my brother was 19 months old, and you're like, well, he doesn't even remember what happened to him. Well, the body keeps the score, and the body knows. And you know this from the work that you do. That has been embedded in his brain chemistry. It's altered his brain chemistry, and we did not know that. We didn't know that. And back then, the decade, they call it the 90s, the decade of the brain, because we understand now that trauma literally changes brain chemistry, and healing's possible also. They say the brain is plastic, so it can be rewired. And that's one of the things that we work with families on, is to help rewire those connections that are essential to relational health, essential to mental health. But if you don't know that going into this, then you think, oh, well, they don't even remember what happened to them. Well, their body does. And when it starts manifesting at 6 years old or 10 years old or 15 years old, developmentally, you may need some help.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly where I wanted to take the conversation, was this idea of, maybe this isn't the right way to say it, but I can't come up with anything else. This idea of sort of parent ego, that, like you said before, like this idea that, well, I've parented biological children before, or how hard can this really be? Right. Like, I mean, I see this a lot in my own like friendships and people that I know who've gone through foster care and had different experiences. But even in some personal stories, and I won't share who, but I know I have some very close connections who have had experiences as adopted children who are now adults, where they look back and they realize that their adoptive parents, of course, were always loving and always supportive, but there was almost this denial or something that was happening insofar as, not wanting to acknowledge the loss that the child had gone through. Like, perhaps, I'm trying to think of a way to summarize, like, really just this story that was being sort of left out of the room, right? Like, if the child had questions growing up, the parent was just sort of like, would sort of brush them aside, or it wouldn't be talked about, right? Or it would be, well, we're your parents, right? And I like to think of that as sort of in the same bucket, like this sort of parent ego piece. So what do you see with that? Like, is that common to see as well, where adoptive parents are sort of just, they think they can handle it, or they just sort of, I don't want to say overlook the loss, but they emotionally can't handle it themselves, so therefore they kind of pass that on to their children?
Yes. So I think it's right. I don't think that acknowledgement of the loss and adoption, I don't know how mainstream that is. It's, this is the world I live in, so I'm too close to it to say without a bias. But I didn't know that. I didn't even know that when I started the organization, in 2008. I didn't really understand. I still was on this, it's beautiful, it's wonderful, yes, let's help you grow your family. Um, Not really understanding that loss piece. And, it's important to look at your own motives. What are your own, if you're not honest with yourself about why you want to do foster care, why you want to do adoption, then that is inevitably going to shape your parenting, but it could also produce some insecurity around, well, I'm the parents, like we've given this child everything. We gave this child a life that they wouldn't have otherwise. They could have ended up, you paint all these pictures. And so the challenge with that is not acknowledging that loss and not understanding how normal those questions are. And maybe if there's questions about, or they say, I miss my biological mom, or I wish I could see her. I wish I knew what she looked like, or what did my dad look like? Those things could be seen as a threat because you've given this child a new life, and they're very normal because of that biological tie to experience those things. And we want to be sensitive to, it's the child's story, it's not mom and dad's story. And taking that from them is really withholding something that they need. And the more that is withheld, the more that child is going to experience identity issues, even into their 20s and beyond, because they didn't have a healthy understanding of their own story.
Yeah, so good. I love the way you just described all that, because it's so perfect, and it's exactly what I've seen occur in different cases. And it's almost like, you have to say in those moments, like, it's not about your own insecurity or about what you've been able to provide, right? It is the child's story, whether that child is a child or a grown adult. Like, it is their story, and it's not about you, right? Like, there's this piece of it is really just not about you. I Two things I want to touch on. One thing you mentioned, the body always keeps the score. I've had Lily Carell, our mutual friend, on here. I've had other trauma-informed therapists on the show where we've talked about this book. This book keeps coming up, so definitely going to link it up in the show notes. The Body Keeps the Score. If anybody's not read it, I highly recommend it. We've talked about that, and even just knowing what I know from being a personal trainer and how stress manifests in the body and all this. I mean, it's a very powerful thing. But obviously, there's two sides of this coin, right? Like, there is and this is, I'll see if I can say this the right way. I've seen this happen, especially as my husband and I were going through our first adoption with our oldest daughter. We met a lot of other couples along the way, thanks to the home study process and otherwise, who were coming into adoption also from a place of loss. Perhaps they had miscarriages, or they had an inability to conceive and were dealing with infertility. And we saw this so often where, our personal story was, we did have an infertility struggle, but we also had always had a desire to adopt. And so for us, we were just like, this is the route we're going to go. It didn't feel like we were losing something, so we needed to adopt. Does that make sense? So I feel like, but we met so many couples who were really almost coming from this saddened place of grief to seek a baby, right? And to create that family. But then you also have the other side, which we've been talking about, which is the baby itself, or the foster child, themselves coming into this also from a place of loss, right? And so there's really two sides of this, and there's really two sides of trauma. And so it makes sense that we see this happen, where when they do become a family, perhaps there's that loss on the parental side of those insecurities, right? I've given this baby a home, and this is fulfilling my dream, and this is my family, but also the other side of the coin with the child too. So again, just remembering that concept of what is about you and what isn't about you, and being able to differentiate that line and to help your child through that process. I also want to touch on something that I think we talked about briefly in our previous conversation that I think our listeners would want to hear, which is, you had mentioned, and I see this all the time, this theme of gotcha day, especially on social media. and how a lot of times adoptive parents will post pictures and they'll say happy gotcha day. It's this big sort of holiday for these adopted children. And when my husband and I first made any sort of social media post about the day that our adoptions were finalized, we made very conscious choices to not use that terminology. And we make very conscious choices when we're talking to our daughters that it's never about us rescuing. It's never about the fact that we rescued them from some situation or from someone who didn't love them or anything like that. That instead it's our day. It's the day that our family became a family, right? Instead, this is something we celebrate because this is the day that you became officially part of our family, and that's what we want to celebrate. So I'd love for you to touch on that, because I know you mentioned it before, and I'd love for our listeners to hear.
Yeah. I think there has been a shift around that. I do still see Gotcha Day on social media as well, but the voice of adult adoptees have illuminated how that feels. And I mean, who wants to say gotcha? Like, what you get you from? Like it has a negative connotation that can be damaging and cause more confusion for the child, and we want to avoid that. So I think there's better ways to do it. And as your children age, even asking them, what do you want to call it, or how do you want to celebrate this day? Because I have a friend, she's adopted multiple children, and they're older now, teenagers and in their early 20s, and they just want normalcy, like recognition of being different to them doesn't feel good. And so you have to honor and respect too, as your child ages. Maybe you celebrated, if they're from another country, maybe you celebrate that. I have a friend just actually this past weekend was celebrating Ethiopian New Year or Christmas. I think it was Ethiopian Christmas. And that's awesome, because her daughter was adopted from Ethiopia, but there may come a time where she doesn't want to do that anymore, and honoring the child's desires, because that is the wrestling with the identity. And usually it switches to where they really embrace where they came from, but being sensitive to your child's needs as they age, because they have their own thoughts and opinions about those things. Jenni, can I ask to go back to you asked earlier about, what do I wish people knew?
Yeah, please feel free.
Because I want to make sure we hit on this. We've talked a little bit about trauma and the impact, and the way that can manifest in a child's life can be really big behaviors that are unsettling to parents. And what I want people to hear is that it is possible to heal. It is possible to heal the brain. It's possible to heal from that loss that the child has experienced. And what we teach parents is it's through connection. And that's the rewiring of the brain, because a child who's been harmed in relationship can only heal in the context of relationship. And I'll just take foster care as an example. If a child has experienced some of those huge things that we've already talked about, and now they're in a safe place, well, that doesn't necessarily mean their body feels safe. In their mind, their cortisol levels have been elevated for probably a long period of time based on what they've experienced, and they're on high alert, which they can't articulate, right? It's inside their body. They might be hyperreactive. They might be super impulsive. They might, be defending themselves in ways that are physical or violent because of what they've experienced. And what we teach parents is strategies to connect with their child in a safe way, so that you're creating that psychological safety, that you're here, we want you, you are safe here, and teaching them how to interact with their child in a way that's connected, that builds attachment, because attachment is what heals the brain from trauma. And so it's really important that we talk about that, because it's not enough to be trauma informed. We have to be trauma responsive. It's like, I could be informed that drinking that healthy protein shake you just took would be the best choice instead of the breakfast taco I really wanted this morning. But doesn't mean that informed is not enough. We have to actually respond to the knowledge that we're gaining. So that's why the application of that knowledge that you learned in the 30 hours, it's not sufficient for the lifetime of a child. We've got to actually take in the knowledge and then respond in a way that's going to meet the child's needs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm so glad you came back to that. That's so good. And I love, saying that the solution here is connection. I wrote down just in my notes that, that adoption is not just rescuing a child or building a family, that it's really just about unconditional love. And how can it be something that both starts the journey and, successfully executes the journey? Like, how can it be something that's just what it is, unconditional? It seems to me like that's really deep down, like where your passion lies, is making sure that families are fully committed to carrying this through in a way that serves all members. I love that. So I want to make sure that, we point to everything that you're doing with Chosen, but before we get to that, I also want to touch on, some other resources that people could potentially look into. If you have any, we can always link it up in the show notes too. So you can always send it to me later, but if you have any books or podcasts or topics that are sort of your go-to, I'd love to hear what those are.
Sure. So first, if you're listening to this with National Adoption Month, and your interests are piqued, or maybe you've always thought about adoption, I read a statistic, I think it was by the Barna Group, that 2/3 of Americans have considered adoption. That's a lot. And so far less actually adopt. But, we have over 400,000 kids in foster care that are aching to be in a home, to be in a family. So if you've considered it or thought about it, if you want to adopt from birth and you need financial resources, there are a number of groups out there that still help fund adoptions. We don't do that any longer, but ABBA Fund is one, Life Song, Show Hope. Those are some adoption agencies that help with funding. If you're interested in adoption at all, I would say the Connected Child, it's a go-to. Karen Purvis, God rest her soul, she was instrumental in understanding the biology and neurobiology of how trauma impacts the brain and why that connection is so important for healing. There's been a subsequent book written called The Connected Parent. So it's the other side of that coin. It came out about 2 years ago. And those are incredible resources. The pages, you want those falling out. Dan Siegel is the one who wrote The Body Keeps the Score. And that one's a little heavy on the scientific side, but anything that he's written is so helpful in parenting and parenting children with hard histories. The other one that I want to mention is called What Happened to You. That is written by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. And it's an interview style. He's the leading clinician in our space and has devoted his career over 40 years to trauma, its impact, and helping children and people heal from trauma. But I love this book because when we see a child who's out of control, or we see a youth who is in juvie, or we see somebody who has substance abuse, and we say, what's wrong with you? That's the wrong question. It's what happened to you. There's something underneath all of that pain that is driving behaviors. And what happened to you, that book is really instrumental, groundbreaking in us moving the narrative to understand the impact of trauma. And it even dips into the epigenetic factors of how we can pass on trauma in our DNA, how trauma affects a child in the womb if there's substance exposed, or there's domestic violence, or the mother was under significant stress, that still impacts a baby. and understanding that so that it gives us empathy and compassion for a child or youth or even an adult. I mean, people don't wake up and decide to be crazy, right? And so, or to make really terrible decisions. It comes from oftentimes hard histories. And those books are a wealth of resources for anybody who's considering foster care or adoption.
Perfect. I'll link all those up in the show notes. We've read The Connected Child as part of our education for our home study, and I've read Body Keeps the Score, but I'm interested in the others as well. I'll link those up for everyone. You brought up something that I think we'll sort of wrap up with today before we point people toward Chosen, which is really something that I'm passionate about too. And it was something that I was, even as an adopted child, not familiar with. I mean, I was familiar with it, but not from this angle, I guess, until we were doing it ourselves as parents. And that is this idea of adoption friendly language. And it's kind of like what you just said with the topic of the book, right? Instead of what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. But also even just from the perspective of, and I know my girls get this question, and I got this question growing up, which is, where'd you come from? Right? Like, where did you come from? Or, you know, I hate to say this, but I got this question a lot, which was like, why did your birth mom not want you? Right? Like, and it's, I mean, these are really like harsh examples of what can be said, but there's also other things. I know even when we're talking to our children about adoption, things that we have to be mindful of saying too, right? Like, trying to think of an example of, you know, when we're sharing like the hospital story, or we're sharing, you know, pieces about birth mothers, right, in our personal lives. We have to be very careful how we go about doing that. And so I'd love to just touch on this briefly, because I think regardless of whether you're someone who's thinking of adopting or not, you know someone who is adopted, I'm sure. And being more mindful of the language that you're using around that is so key. And so for anyone listening, I think this is a powerful way to wrap up. Can you touch on adoption friendly language for us?
Yeah, it is so poignant. And Jenni, you probably, given your own journey, you probably have better ideas on adoption friendly language than I do. But I think just putting yourself in the shoes of the child, and like that question that people ask you, why did your mother give you up? We coach families around not even using that phraseology. The reality is we should celebrate that this mother made a very difficult decision to give her child life, right? And it was a selfless decision to actually choose the route of adoption. And so I think probably society, we've got a long way to go on this front. But if you put yourself in the child's shoes, and words cut, right? I think all of us can remember things that were said to us as a child that have scarred us. And we don't want there to be scars that come from that adoption language. And it's also how we honor the birth family, because you are going to shape your child's perception of their mom and dad, their biological mom and dad. And if you and you tell them what you know, you're honest with them about what you do know and what you don't know. And there's age appropriate resources for sure. And I can send you some of those so that you can link those as well. There's age appropriate resources so that you have the right language for a child, so that you're not dishonoring, but you are being mindful of the story that's going to be constructed over the time that they're in your household.
Yeah. Yeah. And just from personal experience, we were at the pool this summer, and someone that was at the pool, a child actually, had noticed that my oldest was different skin color than mom and dad, right? And so the question was, how come your skin's so dark and your mom and dad's are so light? And her first answer was, well, my skin is the same color as my sissy's, because her sister has the same skin color. And then, of course, she's only 5. And he just kept asking, right? And this is another innocent 5-year-old, right? That perhaps this just hasn't been taught to him or whatever. And he's just genuinely interested in asking these questions. So then he asks, like, well, where did you come from? And she, with all the pride in the world, she turned and looked at him and she goes, what do you mean? I'm from the USA. It was so funny. and sometimes kids can really teach you like, well, why am I stressing out about an answer? Like she's got it, she's got it covered. She's from the USA, like, you silly boy. But anyway,
Yeah,
it was interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I love, I do, obviously the name of the organization is Chosen. And I do love that you can say, I chose you, or you grew in mommy's heart. Like those things are really meaningful for a child. Somebody did not want you. We wanted you. Like we chose you, and
Yeah.
we got to choose. I didn't get to choose my biological. We got to choose. And that's powerful language. The other thing, I'm glad you mentioned the transracial piece. And one of the links that we can put in the show notes is to the resources that we have on our website for transracial families, because the majority of families that we serve are transracial. And that cultural piece is huge. And what we find is so many parents are under-equipped or ill-equipped to navigate those hard conversations with their child. And that's like not being honest that they were adopted. You can't avoid that messy part of the story. You have to you want to navigate it in a beautiful way that honors their history and their family of origin. And we just find that is a really difficult topic for families. And then when these big things happen in the news, and then it causes distress in the home because the family is like, I don't know how to talk to them about race. Families really need help on that front, and we can provide some resources there.
Yeah, and we have a guest coming on the podcast to specifically talk about transracial adoption as well. So I'll make sure to link that up in the show notes too. I mean, from our experience, one of the most powerful things that anyone ever said to us was when we were going through our first adoption. Someone said to us, if your child is biracial or another race than you, the number one thing that you can do as parents is to constantly put yourself in the place where you are the minority. And that was one of the most powerful things anyone ever said to us, because you don't realize, the church that you go to or the school that your child goes to, like, are they the token child in the room of that skin color? And then, there have been times where my daughter and I have gone to an African-American salon. Trust me, I am the minority. Like it is, but I have to, are you willing to make yourself uncomfortable? Because in a lot of cases, your child may feel uncomfortable. And that's something that a lot of parents don't realize. So I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of transracial adoption at this point, because it is something we're going to cover more in depth, but I'm glad you touched on that. And we'll make sure to link those resources up in the show notes. But yeah, I want you to point people to how they can hear more about Chosen, definitely the website, how they can find more about you. So take it away.
Sure. So what we do is help the caregivers and the parents navigate these messy parts of the story. And our website is chosen.care. You can find a wealth of resources there. We are a national organization. We have a telehealth model. And the primary piece of our work is parent coaching. And we are teaching parents new strategies and trauma responsive, evidence-based practices so that they can help their child heal in their home. Children don't heal in a therapy office. They heal in the context of families. And so equipping caregivers, we are so passionate about that. We do have therapy services as well for both the parents and for the youth that may be age appropriate. We do some in-home work in the areas that we're in, but we primarily use telehealth. And so you can find us at chosen.care, and we would love to serve anybody who's interested. There are a number of free resources on our website as well, if anybody wants to learn more.
Excellent. Well, we got lots of resources to connect to today. So everyone's going to have to make sure they swipe up to see the show notes. It'll make it easier for you. All the links will be there. But Jenni, thank you so much for taking time out of your day. You're such a light. And I love when I meet people who have just been called on, right? They feel this calling from God or a higher being to really serve people in a certain way. And clearly your mission in life was, you were probably put here on earth, I assume, to be an advocate for this, right? To be someone who's willing to argue and willing to stand up for children and for families in the long term. So I'm so grateful for you. I'm glad our paths have crossed. Thank you to Lily for connecting us. This is going to be a very powerful episode that I know will affect a lot of potentially adoptive parents out there or parents who are navigating this themselves. Chosen is a great resource. So thank you so much for being here, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you for having me. It was an honor to be with you today. Bye, Jenni.
Bye-bye.